There comes a moment in every emotionally imbalanced relationship where effort stops producing connection and starts producing distance. That moment is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself with a dramatic argument or a final goodbye. Instead, it builds quietly through unanswered messages, delayed responses, emotional withdrawal, and a growing sense that the more you try, the less you receive. That's exactly where she found herself. At first, like most people dealing with an avoidant partner, she
did what felt natural.
She leaned in. She tried to communicate more clearly, love more deeply, and reassure more consistently. She believed logically that if she could just show enough care, enough patience, enough understanding, something would shift. But what she didn't realize at the time is that avoidant patterns don't respond to intensity with closeness. They respond to intensity with distance. And so the cycle began. The more she reached out, the more he pulled back. The more they explained her feelings, the more he shut down. It wasn't because he didn't care, it was because at a psychological level, closeness began to feel like pressure, and pressure triggered his need to escape. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They interpret withdrawal as a signal to give more. But in reality, for an avoidant, withdrawal is often a signal that there is already too much. What made this moment a breaking point wasn't just his behavior, it was her realization. She began to see that her actions, while well-intentioned, were part of a pattern of overextending, over-explaining, and over-functioning emotionally in a space that wasn't being equally held. And that awareness is uncomfortable because it shifts the narrative from why are they doing this to me to what role am I playing in this dynamic? That question changes everything because once you see your role, you regain your power. Not power over the other person, but power over your own responses. And she started to understand that chasing wasn't love. It was fear. Fear of losing the connection. Fear of abandonment. Fear that if she didn't hold everything together, it would all fall apart. But the truth is, anything that requires you to abandon yourself in order to maintain it is already unstable. So she did something that, on the surface, looked simple, but psychologically, it was profound. She stopped chasing. Not as a tactic, not as a game, but as a decision rooted in. They self-respect. She allowed silence where there used to be urgency. She allowed space where there used to be pressure. And most importantly, she turned her attention inward instead of outward. This is where the real shift begins, not in the relationship, but within the individual. Because when you stop trying to control someone else's behavior, you're forced to confront your own emotional patterns. You start to notice the impulse to reach out, to fix, to seek reassurance. And instead of acting on, it automatically, you sit with it. You observe it. You begin to understand it. That's not weakness, that's emotional discipline. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop chasing is the moment you stop reinforcing the very dynamic that was pushing them away. You're no longer feeding the cycle. You're interrupting it. But more than that, you're reclaiming something far more valuable than their attention. You're reclaiming your center. Because real power in any relationship is not about who cares. Less. It's about who remains grounded, self-directed, and emotionally sovereign, regardless of the other person's behavior. And in that moment, when she chose to stop chasing, she didn't just change the direction of the relationship, she changed the direction of herself. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make isn't to hold on tighter, but to finally let go of the need to. Once she stepped out of the cycle of chasing, something unfamiliar emerged space. And in that space, there was no longer a constant distraction of reacting to him. There was just her own mind, her own emotional patterns, and the quiet discomfort of not knowing what to do next. This is where most people relapse back into old behavior, because stillness can feel more threatening than chaos. But instead of rushing to fill that silence, she became curious about it. That curiosity led her to something unexpected, not another communication strategy, not a way to win him back, but a philosophy that challenged the very foundation of how she had been approaching the relationship. It was Hooponopono, an ancient Hawaiian practice built on a deceptively simple framework. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Now, at first glance, this can sound almost too simple, even abstract. 4 phrases? How does that change anything in a complex emotional dynamic? But the power of it isn't in the words themselves, it's in what they force you to confront. Because Hooponopono is not about fixing the other person. It's about taking radical responsibility for your internal state. And that's a difficult shift. We are conditioned to believe that our emotional reactions are caused by external events, what someone said, what they didn't say, how they behaved. But this practice flips that assumption. It suggests that whatever is showing up in your emotional experience is in some way yours to process, yours to heal. Not because you caused the other person's behavior, but because your response to it is they where your power lies. So instead of analyzing him why he pulled away, what he was thinking, whether he would come back, she began analyzing herself. Not in a critical way, but in an honest way. When she felt anxiety, instead of reaching for her phone, she sat with the feeling and repeated those 4 phrases internally. I'm sorry, not as guilt, but as an acknowledgement of the tension within herself. Please forgive me, a release of self-judgment. Thank you, a recognition that even discomfort is. Revealing something important. I love you, a return to self-connection. What this did over time was subtle but powerful. It broke the automatic link between stimulus and reaction. Instead of reacting impulsively to his distance, she created a pause. And in that pause, she reclaimed choice. She was no longer operating from emotional urgency. She was operating from awareness. This is where the philosophy becomes deeply practical. Because when you stop trying to control the external, you conserve energy. And that energy can be redirected inward to your own growth, your own clarity, your own stability. She wasn't using Hooponopono as a technique to get him back. In fact, that intention would have undermined the entire process. She was using it to become someone who no longer needed to chase in the first place. And here's the deeper psychological truth. People don't respond to what you say nearly as much as they respond to what you are. Your emotional state communicates constantly, often, more powerfully than your words. When she shifted from anxiety to calm, from neediness to groundedness, from control to acceptance, the entire dynamic began to recalibrate, not because she forced it, but because she changed the energy she was bringing into it. But even beyond the relationship, something more important was happening. She was developing emotional self-sufficiency. She was learning how to process discomfort without outsourcing it to someone else. And that is a rare skill. Most people spend years, even decades, trying to manage their emotions by managing other people. She was doing the opposite, managing herself, regardless of what others did. That's what makes this practice so transformative. It doesn't promise a specific outcome in the relationship. It promises something far more valuable, internal alignment. And from that place, your decisions become clearer, your boundaries become stronger, and your sense of self becomes less dependent on external validation. So while it may have started as a response to a relationship, it evolved into something much bigger, a shift in how she related to herself. Because the moment you stop trying to fix others and start healing within, you don't just change your relationships, you change your entire reality. As she continued practicing this internal shift, something even more confronting began to surface the subtle ways. Blame had been woven into her thinking, not always overt, not always spoken, but present in the background. The quiet narrative of, if he would just communicate better, if he would just show up differently, then I could finally feel at peace. It's a familiar pattern, and on the surface it seems reasonable. But psychologically, it creates a dependency. Your emotional state becomes contingent on someone else's behavior. What Hooponopono forced her to do was dismantle that dependency, not by denying his actions or pretending everything was acceptable, but by recognizing that holding on to blame was keeping her emotionally entangled, because blame in its essence is a way of trying to control reality after the fact. It keeps your focus locked outward, constantly evaluating, judging, and waiting for the other person to change so you can feel better. But here's the deeper truth: blame doesn't just affect you, it feels. Even when unspoken, it shows up in tone and energy, in the subtle tension between two people. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that tension is enough. Trigger withdrawal. Avoidants are highly sensitive to perceived pressure, criticism, or expectation. The moment they feel judged or emotionally cornered, their instinct is not to move closer, it's to create distance. So every time she approached him from a place of frustration, even if her words were calm, the underlying energy carried weight. It carried expectation. It carried the message that something wasn't enough. And whether consciously or not, he responded to that. When she began to truly release blame, something shifted, not in him at first, but in the emotional atmosphere of the relationship. Conversations became lighter, less loaded. Silences became less threatening. She wasn't constantly trying to extract reassurance or clarity. She allowed things to be as they were without immediately trying to reshape them. This is where many people misunderstand the idea of letting go. They think it means becoming passive or accepting less than they deserve. But that's not what was happening here. She wasn't lowering her standards, she was removing the emotional pressure attached to them. There's a difference. One comes from resignation, the other comes from strength. Because when you're no longer operating from blame, you also stop overcompensating. You stop trying to prove your worth. Stop trying to earn consistency. Stop trying to manage the other person's emotional availability. You step out of the role of emotional caretaker and return to being an equal participant. That shift is significant because relationships are not sustained by effort alone, they're sustained by balance. When one person is overfunctioning, the other often underfunctions. Not always intentionally, but as a natural response to the dynamic. By stepping back, by releasing the need to fix and correct, she allowed that imbalance to recalibrate. At the same time, she became more aware of her own emotional triggers. Instead of projecting them outward, she processed them inward. If she felt neglected, she explored that feeling rather than immediately attributing it to his behavior. If she felt anxious, she didn't rush to close the gap. She sat with the discomfort and allowed it to pass without action. That's not suppression, that's regulation. And regulation changes everything. Because when you're regulated, you're no longer reacting, you're choosing. You're no longer driven by fear or urgency, you're grounded in clarity. And from that place, your presence becomes lighter, more. They open, less demanding. For the avoidant partner, this creates something rare: emotional space without consequence. No immediate backlash, no pressure to perform, no expectation to meet a demand they're not ready for. And in that space, something interesting happens. The need to escape diminishes. The resistance softens, not because they've been convinced, but because the environment no longer feels threatening. But again, the most important shift wasn't external, it was internal. She no longer needed him to change in order to feel stable. She had separated her emotional state from his behavior. And that is a form of freedom most people never fully reach in relationships. Because when you release blame, you don't just free the other person, you free yourself from the constant cycle of expectation and disappointment. And in that freedom, you stop asking, why aren't they showing up for me? And start living from a place where your peace is no longer negotiable. As this internal work deepened, something subtle but undeniable began to change in the space between them. Not through effort, not through strategy, but through what can only be described as an energetic shift. And while that word energy can sometimes feel vague or abstract, in human relationships, it's actually very concrete. It shows up in your tone, your timing, your expectations, your presence. It's the difference between someone feeling managed versus feeling met. Before, her presence carried a kind of invisible urgency. Even when she was calm on the surface, there was an undercurrent of needing something: clarity, reassurance, consistency. And that need, however justified, translated into pressure. For an avoidant partner, pressure doesn't register as love. It registers as a loss of autonomy. But now that pressure was gone. She wasn't waiting for immediate replies. She wasn't reading into every pause. She wasn't trying to decode his behavior or steer the interaction toward a specific outcome. There was a lightness in how she showed up, a groundedness that didn't demand anything in return. And that shift, though internal, completely changed the emotional environment. Because people don't just respond to your actions, they respond to the meaning behind them. When your actions are driven by anxiety, even if they appear kind, they can feel heavy. When your actions are grounded in self-sufficiency, even silence can feel safe. That's the paradox she stepped into. For the first time, he wasn't interacting with someone who was trying to pull something out of him. He was interacting with someone who was simply present. No agenda, no subtle pressure, no emotional hooks. And that created something rare for an avoidant space without expectation. And space, when it's not loaded with consequence, becomes safety. This is where many people get it wrong. They think creating distance will push someone further away. And sometimes it does if that distance is laced with resentment or used as a tactic. But this wasn't distance in that sense. This was emotional spaciousness, a removal of tension, not connection. A shift from I need you to respond a certain way to I am okay regardless of how you respond. That distinction changes everything. Because when someone no longer feels like they're being managed or evaluated, their natural defenses begin to lower. The constant scanning for pressure, for expectation, for emotional demand, it starts to quiet down. And in that quiet, there's room for something new to emerge. He began to feel less need to withdraw, not because she asked him to stay, but because there was nothing to escape from. The interaction no longer felt like a test he could fail or a demand he couldn't meet. It felt neutral, even safe. And safety is the foundation of all genuine connection. What's important to understand here is that she didn't create this shift by doing more. She created it by removing what didn't need to be there in the first place: control, urgency, and the need to define every moment. She stopped trying to force connection and instead allowed it to breathe. At the same time, she became more attuned to the rhythm of the interaction. Instead of pushing for depth when it wasn't available, she met him where he was without abandoning herself. That's a delicate balance, but it's powerful because it communicates respect not just for him, but for herself. And respect, unlike pressure, invites reciprocity. Now, none of this happened. They die. Overnight, there wasn't a sudden transformation or a dramatic turning point. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. But over time, the cumulative effect of her consistency, her groundedness, and her emotional independence began to reshape the dynamic. Because when one person in a system changes, the system itself has to adjust. And that's the real lesson here. You don't shift relationships by trying to control the other person. You shift them by changing the field in which relationship exists. When the pressure disappears, when the emotional weight is lifted, when presence replaces expectation, what remains is something far more powerful than control. It's space. And in the right conditions, space doesn't create distance, set creates the possibility for real connection to finally emerge. Because the moment someone feels free around you is the moment they no longer feel the need to run. And then, without announcement, without any dramatic turning point, something began to happen that would have seemed unlikely in the earlier phase of the relationship. He started to move closer, not in a grand cinematic way. There was no sudden declaration, no complete personality shift. It was quieter than that, subtle changes in behavior that if you weren't paying attention, you might miss. A message initiated without prompting. A slightly longer conversation than usual. A moment of openness that didn't immediately shut down. Small, almost insignificant actions on the surface, but psychologically, they carried weight because this time his movement wasn't a reaction to pressure. It wasn't compliance. It was choice. And that distinction matters. When someone acts under pressure, their behavior is often temporary, driven by the need to relieve discomfort. But when someone moves towards you freely, without coercion or expectation, that movement is authentic. It reflects a genuine shift in how safe they feel within the connection. What created that safety wasn't persuasion. It wasn't perfectly crafted communication. It was the absence of demand. For the first time, he wasn't being pulled into closeness, he was stepping into it. And that changes the entire emotional experience. Because now, instead of associating the relationship with obligation or pressure, he could begin to associate it with ease, with autonomy, with a sense that he could engage without losing himself. This is particularly significant for someone with avoidant tendencies. At their core, they are. Avoidants are not avoiding connection, they're avoiding the feeling of being overwhelmed within connection. They fear enmeshment, loss of independence, the subtle expectation that they must meet emotional needs they don't feel equipped to handle. So when those fears are no longer activated, their natural capacity for connection can begin to surface. And that's exactly what started to unfold. He became more curious, more present. Not consistently, not perfectly, but noticeably. And here's where growth became even more critical, because the moment many people start to see this kind of shift, they revert back to old patterns. They get excited, hopeful, and unintentionally reintroduce pressure, wanting to lock in the change, define it, secure it. But she didn't do that. She stayed grounded. She didn't overinterpret his actions or rush to assign meaning to every small step forward. She allowed the process to unfold at its own pace without trying to accelerate it. And that restraint is not. Passive, it's a form of strength. It requires trust, not just trust in him, but trust in herself and in the process she had committed to, because she understood something fundamental. If the connection was going to evolve, it had to do so naturally. Anything forced would only recreate the same cycle they had just stepped out of. So when he reached out, she responded, but without overinvestment. When he opened up, she listened, but without trying to deepen it prematurely. She met him where he was, not where she wanted him to be. And that consistency reinforced the new dynamic. It signaled that this space was different. That engagement didn't come with hidden expectations. Over time, this created a feedback loop. The safer he felt, the more he engaged. The more he engaged, the more he engaged, the more evidence she had that stepping back had been the right move. But importantly, her sense of stability no longer depended on his engagement. That was the real transformation, because now his actions were no longer the source of her emotional state then, were simply information. And that shift changes how you experience everything. You're no longer reacting to every change in behavior. You're observing, responding thoughtfully, and maintaining your center regardless of what unfolds. What makes this stage so powerful is that it reveals a truth many people struggle to accept. Connection cannot be forced into existence. It can only be invited. An invitation requires space, not pressure. By stepping out, the role of pursuer, she gave him the opportunity to step into the role of participant. Not because she asked him to, but because for the first time he could. And that's the paradox at the heart of all meaningful relationships. The moment you stop trying to make someone choose you is often the moment they finally can. And this is where the story reaches a point that most people don't expect, because by now, the question is no longer, did he come back or did the relationship finally work? Those questions, while important on the surface, are no longer central. Something far more significant has already taken place. She changed. Not in a superficial way, not in a way designed to adapt to him, but at the level of identity. The anxious urgency that once drove her decisions had been replaced with something steadier, something more deliberate. She was no longer reacting to emotional discomfort as if it were a problem to solve immediately. She had learned how to hold it, to understand. To move through it without losing herself in the process. And that shift redefined the entire framework of the relationship. Because now she wasn't engaging from a place of need. She was engaging from a place of choice. If he reached out, she could respond with openness, but she didn't depend on it. If he pulled back, she noticed it, but it didn't destabilize her. There was space between his actions and her sense of self. And in that space, there was freedom. This is what emotional. Independence actually looks like not detachment, not indifference, but the ability to remain connected to yourself regardless of what someone else does, and it changes what you tolerate. Before, inconsistency felt like something to manage, something to work through, something that required more effort, more patience, more understanding. Now she could see it clearly without distortion. She wasn't excusing it, and she wasn't overreacting to it. She was simply observing it as data. And from that place, her standards became quieter but stronger. She no longer needed to convince herself that something was enough. She could feel with clarity whether it was or it wasn't. That kind of clarity doesn't come from analyzing the other person. It comes from being deeply anchored in yourself. And that's what Hooponopono had given her, not control over the relationship, but alignment within herself. Ironically, this is also what creates the healthiest form of attraction, not the kind built on pursuit or validation, but the kind that emerges when someone senses that you are whole on your own. There's no grasping, no subtle negotiation for attention. There's presence, there's openness, but there's also a clear boundary. I am here because I choose to be, not because I need to be. And that energy is unmistakable. At this point, whether the relationship fully evolved or not almost became secondary, because she was no longer operating from a place where the outcome defined her. If they continued to meet her with consistency, there was space for something real to grow. If he didn't, she had the capacity to step away without collapsing into self-doubt or emotional chaos. That's the real transformation. Most people think the goal is to fix the relationship, but the deeper goal, the one that actually changes your life, is to develop a relationship with yourself that is stable, respectful, and grounded. Because from that place, you stop negotiating your worth. You stop chasing clarity from people who are unclear. You stop investing energy where there is no mutual movement, and you begin to understand something that isn't often said directly. Love is not proven by how much you can endure. It's revealed by what you are willing to accept and what you are not. So in the end, what happened wasn't just that the dynamic shifted. It's that she became someone who no longer needed the dynamic to define her experience. She could participate in the relationship, but she was not longer consumed by it. And that is a level of freedom that very few people reach, not because it's complicated, but because it requires the courage to turn inward instead of constantly reaching outward. Because when you finally become whole within yourself, you stop asking whether someone else will choose you, and you start living in a way where only the right ones can. When you step back and look at this entire journey, it becomes clear that what appeared to be a strategy to change someone else was in reality a process of transforming oneself. It began with frustration, confusion, and the instinct to chase, but it evolved into awareness, discipline, and ultimately emotional freedom. At no point did she force him to change. She didn't convince, persuade, or manipulate her way into connection. What she did was far more powerful and far more rare. She changed the way she showed up. She removed pressure, released blame, and took full responsibility for her internal state. And in doing, so she shifted the entire dynamic without ever directly trying to control it. Yes, his behavior began to change. Yes, he moved closer, engaged more, and responded differently. But that was never the real victory. The real victory was that she no longer needed those changes to feel whole, stable, or secure. Because that's the trap most people fall into. They believe the outcome is the relationship. But the truth is, the outcome is who you become in the process of navigating it. She became grounded where she was once anxious, clear where she was once confused, self-directed where she was once dependent. And from that place, she gained something far more valuable than reassurance. She gained certainty within herself. And here's the deeper truth that applies to anyone listening. Relationships don't transform when you try harder. They transform when you show up differently. Not performatively, not as a tactic, but at the level of identity. When you stop chasing, stop forcing, stop attaching your emotional state to someone else's behavior, you create the conditions for something real to emerge. Sometimes that leads the other person back to you. Sometimes it reveals that they were never capable of meeting you where you stand. But either way, you win because you are no longer operating from a place of need, but from a place of strength. So the question is no longer, will they choose me? The question becomes, am I choosing myself in the way I show up, in what I tolerate, and in what I allow into my life? Because the moment you truly do that, everything changes. And that is the real power behind this story. Not that she got him back, but that she found herself. And from that place, she could never be lost again.